Imagine the shore at dawn. A thin mist lifts off the water. The air holds the cold, wet smell of the lake, and a single boat rocks against the sand. The quiet is broken, sudden, raw, by a voice that does not belong to the place. A scream that makes the fishermen in the nearest vessel look over, and the crowd on the beach instinctively step back. That sound marks the edge between ordinary life and a rupture no one in that region expected. It is there, on that shoreline, that the question arises which still troubles readers centuries later. Why did Jesus allow demons to enter the pigs? Before we rush to a satisfying answer, we must linger for a moment in the scene itself. The Gospel writers, most notably Mark in chapter 5 and Luke in chapter 8, place us in a borderland, a Gentile countryside where Jewish purity codes meet a different economy and a different set of gods, and where a man lives on the margins of society. He's described as dwelling among the tombs, wearing no proper clothes, chained by those who tried to restrain him, repeatedly harming himself as a desperate gesture against the force that controls him. He is a portrait of brokenness in its most public form. Fear and violence made visible. Into that brokenness steps Jesus. The text is careful to show that from the beginning, the demonic recognizes him. They call him Son of the Most High God, and they speak, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" A recognition and a question wrapped in dread and defiance. Then comes the word that will haunt interpreters. The demons say their name is Legion, for there are many of them. And when Jesus confronts them, they beg. They beg not to be sent into the abyss. They ask instead to be permitted to enter a nearby herd of pigs. Jesus grants their request. The pigs stampede down a steep slope into the sea and drown. The owners lose their herd. The townspeople, alarmed at the sight and at the financial catastrophe, plead with Jesus to leave. And the man who had been set free, clothed, composed, sitting at Jesus' feet, receives from Jesus a commission. Go home. Tell what the Lord has done for you. The healed man becomes a witness. This is the sequence. This is the raw material. If we keep the narrative intact, arrival, encounter, confession, plea, permission, destruction, reaction, commission, then the question in our title must be approached with humility. The text itself invites multiple layers of meaning, a theological, an ethical, and a pastoral. It does not deliver one single mechanic of spiritual warfare in so many words. It gives a dramatic episode that touches on cosmic reality, social consequence, and personal restoration, all at once. Three complementary answers offer themselves as careful, text-grounded responses to our central question. They are not mutually exclusive. Each sheds light on different aspects of the scene, and together, they form a coherent reading that honors both the authority of Jesus and the dignity of the human being at the center of the story. First, the demon's own fear of the abyss, of the place of restraint and future judgment, helps explain why they would beg for time and why they would prefer another earthly host over immediate consignment. In Luke's account, they explicitly beg Jesus not to send them into the abyss. That plea is a theological window. The New Testament elsewhere gestures at a place where demonic beings are currently held in check until the coming judgment. Texts like 2 Peter 2:4 and certain apocalyptic passages in Revelation speak of angels or spirits restrained in desolate places until the appointed time. To press these passages beyond what they themselves say would be unwise. We must not build detailed mechanics of hell or the timetable of demonic punishment out of one narrative plea. But it is reasonable to see in the demon's request a recognition that their liberty is not eternal, and that some form of restraint is coming. If they feared that restraint, then their logic in the story makes grim sense. Delay, if you can, is preferable to immediate limitation. To beg for delay is not to gain innocence. It is a tactical move. And Jesus, acting in sovereign authority, allows a limited temporary transfer, not because he lacks power over them, but because his action accomplishes more than simply consigning them to immediate demise. The permission exposes the destructive character of these spirits in a concrete way. It allows the community to witness what evil does when it inhabits life and animals, and it makes possible the recovery of the human being who had been reduced to an object of terror. In other words, the permission is not a loss of control. It is an exercise of sovereign judgment that brings the hidden violence of the demonic into the light. It is crucial at this point to retain a hermeneutical humility. The text does not give us a full cosmology of demonic punishment, nor a diagram of the abyss. To speculate dogmatically about the precise nature of the abyss or the chain of custody for demons is to go beyond the witness of Scripture. What we can say, and what Luke and Mark themselves suggest, is that there is a temporal economy in which evil is constrained until its appointed reckoning, and that the demon's plea in the narrative indicates their awareness of that impending restriction. That awareness helps explain the urgency and the tactic of their petition. Second, the choice of pigs as the alternative host carries symbolic and cultural freight that matters for interpretation. In Jewish law, as recorded in Leviticus, pigs are unclean. That designation is about identity markers and boundary maintenance for Israel. It is not, in the Gospel's context, a call for cultural condemnation of those whose diet or economy includes pigs. The man in the story lives in a borderland where Jewish and Gentile worlds meet. The herd of pigs belongs to men who depend on that herd for livelihood. When the demons identify a nearby herd as a convenient host, the story signals an affinity. Evil seeks a place where it can, so to speak, settle without the interior resistance that human repentance and restoration might create. Symbolically, the pigs stand as a kind of theological shorthand for what is impure or untethered to covenantal life. They are not bad in themselves, and the story must not be used to shame cultures that keep pigs as food. But the narrative does suggest that the demonic prefers an environment where moral and spiritual boundaries have already been loosened. The pigs, as unclean animals in Jewish imagination, provide a stark image of the corrosive fit between corruption and impurity. The dramatic image of the herd plunging into the water, then, is not merely about economic loss. It is about the disfiguring influence of evil upon created things when left unchecked. This second line of interpretation helps us see the story as more than an isolated supernatural stunt. It is a theological allegory of contamination and contagion. What makes evil dangerous is not simply its spiritual status. It is its capacity to seize what is vulnerable and to spread brokenness outward, into animals, into economies, into communities. The pigs drown, but their death makes visible the pattern by which evil uses what is unguarded as a staging ground. The result is a public demonstration, not of arbitrary cruelty, but of how profoundly destructive sin and demonic influence can be to life as a whole. At this juncture, it is worth pausing to emphasize again what the narrative does not do. It does not give Christians permission to levy cultural assaults on those who consume pork. It does not provide a universal template for labeling people or illnesses as demonically caused. The presence of pigs in the story functions as a symbol within a particular cultural horizon. The story's theological point is about the affinity of evil for what is exposed, not about the culinary or cultural worth of swine. Having explored the demon's fear of the abyss and the symbolism of impurity represented by the pigs, we arrive at a third, tightly related answer that begins to bring ethical weight into the theological interpretation. Jesus allowed the transfer into the pigs in order to expose publicly the destructive nature of evil, and to prioritize human restoration even at a material cost. This third answer is the one that generates the most discomfort for modern sensibilities, because it confronts us with the question of loss. The herd belongs to owners who, in the economy of their town, depend on those animals for survival, or at least for significant income. The drowning of the herd represents a substantial economic blow. The townspeople who witness the event do not respond with gratitude for the liberation of the man. They respond with fear, grief, and a demand that Jesus leave. In their eyes, the cost outweighs the benefit. What then does Jesus' action teach? At its core, it communicates a priority. The restoration of a human being is worth more than material property. Jesus' ministry repeatedly lifts people from degradation and marginalization and in doing so, he risks the scandal of economic disruption. The healed man's dignity, his return to community, his ability to testify, his restoration to relational life, exceeds the value of the herd. That is a countercultural claim both in the first-century setting and in our own. It suggests that the kingdom of God reorders value, persons over possessions, restoration over profit, liberation over stability, when stability is built upon oppression or corruption. But this answer opens further theological and pastoral questions. If Jesus' permission led to financial ruin for some, does Scripture require the community to bear responsibility? What are the obligations of those whose freedom is won at another's loss? The text itself hints at the possibilities of reconciliation. Jesus commands the healed man to go home and tell, and the man becomes a messenger of what God has done. There is no explicit account of restitution to the pig owners, yet the ethical logic of the story cries for communal response. Christian discipleship lived rightly would not shrug at the material loss of neighbors when liberation has social cost. Rather, a faithful community would accompany the healed person in reintegration while also addressing the harm done to others. At this point in the narrative, our attention must turn to how the community reacts. The townspeople are not simple villains. They are people grappling with fear for their livelihoods and for the equilibrium of their social life. Their demand that Jesus leave is as much about self-preservation as it is about scandal aversion. The reaction compels the reader to wrestle with uncomfortable trade-offs. Do we value safety and economic predictability over the risky work of mercy? Are we willing to be witnesses to freedom even when that freedom unsettles our systems? These initial interpretive moves, fear of the abyss, affinity with impurity, and the public exposure of evil that prioritizes human restoration, are not abstract theology divorced from life. They are lenses for pastoral practice. But before moving into direct application, we must attend to the texture of the story itself. The details that make the scene vivid also reveal the priorities of Jesus' mission. He does not perform a private exorcism that leaves the community ignorant. He produces a public event that transforms perception. The man is not quietly healed and hidden away. He is clothed, calmed, sitting at Jesus' feet. He is restored to the basic markers of human dignity. And Jesus sends him back into the very social fabric that had marginalized him, not as a private beneficiary, but as a living testimony. There is also a theological stake in the demons' self-designation. They call themselves Legion. That name evokes military organization and numerical force, a way of saying, in effect, that the possessed man's condition is not merely one troublesome spirit, but a collective, coordinated oppression. The term intensifies the drama. This is not a petty nuisance. This is an occupying power. Jesus' confrontation with Legion is therefore not a mere demonstration of authority in a vacuum. It is a clash between rival regimes. The permission to enter the pigs, under that light, is not a lapse, but a strategic move within a larger conflict, one in which Jesus' act both frees the person and unmasks the demonic as destructive to the created order. Yet again, we must be careful. The narrative invites us to understand an ongoing battle between the reign of God and opposing powers, but it does not reduce the complexity of human suffering to a simple spiritual taxonomy. The man's wounds are real, and they require human care as well as divine intervention. The story resists simplistic application. It refuses to be a handkerchief that we wave to diagnose every case of mental illness or disorder. Instead, it offers a dense portrait that must be read with pastoral sensitivity. We see the sovereign authority of Jesus over powers, the tragic cost of evil when it is manifest, and the primacy of human dignity in the economy of God. As we dwell longer on the scene, other elements come into focus that will matter when we attempt to bring the story into conversation with pastoral practice. The healed man is sent forth to testify, which suggests that restoration is not static. It is missionary. The healed one's testimony becomes a vehicle of transformation for the wider community. The healed man's presence among his people will challenge their fears, call them to new attentiveness, and potentially reshape the bonds of mutual obligation. In short, the narrative frames healing as testimony, public, social, and missionary. But such a frame also demands that the community take responsibility. When a spiritual intervention produces collateral damage, Christian ethics must ask who will bear that damage, and how will justice or solidarity be enacted. Will the free person be supported as he re-enters social life? Will the owners of the herd receive consideration? The story does not provide a neat financial ledger, but it does present a moral dilemma that the church cannot ignore. If the gospel's work breaks systems that oppress or exploit, the church must be prepared to bear costs, and to tend to both the liberated and those inconvenienced by the process. The story invites no cheap triumphalism. It demands a costly compassion. There is, finally, the matter of fear and misunderstanding. The townspeople's request for Jesus to leave is not merely a narrative footnote, it is an interpretive hinge. Their inability to celebrate the man's freedom reveals a heart hardened by fear of loss. The narrative thereby confronts readers with the reality that conversion and healing can be scandalous. The kingdom's logic overturns expectations. Sometimes saving one life will unsettle the many. It is precisely here that the gospel's ethic of risk becomes most demanding. As these layers accumulate, it becomes clear why simple answers will not suffice. The story resists being folded into a single doctrinal formula. It is at once a portrait of Jesus' authority over spiritual powers, an enactment of the costs of liberation, and a challenge to communities that value property over persons. Our three answers, therefore, work together. The demon's plea points to their awareness of cosmic judgment. The pig's role gestures toward the symbolic fit between corruption and uncleanness, and the public destruction highlights a gospel that prefers human restoration, even at material expense. If this narrative leaves us unsettled, that may be precisely the point. The gospel scene forces us to ask hard questions. If a neighbor's freedom requires a loss on our part, are we prepared to bear it? If spiritual liberation looks messy and costly, will our initial reaction be fear or compassion? These are not merely intellectual exercises. They are the kinds of questions that form the basis for pastoral action. How a church organizes its care, how it plans for economic consequences, and how it trains leaders to respond to manifestations of brokenness without either sensationalizing them or reducing them to purely medical categories. At the same time, theological restraint must guide pastoral practice. We cannot, from Mark's brief narrative, construct a manual that treats every case of mental or emotional distress as demonic possession, nor can we ignore the spiritual dimension of evil in order to reframe everything as clinical pathology. The balance is pastoral. Honor the spiritual stakes without ignoring the need for medical, psychological, and social support. The story itself models this balance in its ambiguity. It gives us signs and symbols, not definitive diagnostic criteria. We have now walked the shoreline, witnessed the encounter, heard the confession of Legion, watched the pigs rush into the sea, and seen the torn responses of a frightened community. We have set out three ways of answering the question in the title, each one shedding light from a different angle. But even at this point, the narrative still holds unresolved tensions that push us forward. The healed man's restoration and his commissioning to testify illuminate the missional afterlife of the miracle. Yet the community's fear raises questions about justice and reconciliation that the story does not fully resolve on its own. The theological implications of the abyss remain suggestive, not exhaustive, and the symbolic reading of the pigs warns us of overreach. It is here, paused between the raw dramatic event and the pastoral work it necessitates, that we must decide how to bring the gospel's truth into concrete practice. What kinds of structures will churches need if they are to respond faithfully to situations where spiritual and social realities intersect? How will communities offer restitution where material loss occurs? How will leaders discern when to call on medical professionals and when to engage in spiritual ministry? These practical questions are not add-ons to the theological reading. They are its necessary corollaries. Consider for a moment the face of the healed man. He is clothed and in his right mind. He has been reclaimed from dehumanization. that recovery is the priority. Yet recovery in the gospel mind does not end in private comfort. It leads to testimony, to reintegration, and to a transformation of the community's imagination about what is possible. The man's testimony will have to contend with the shame and fear of those who lost property. The tension between gratitude for a life regained and grief for a livelihood lost will need pastoral navigation. And so the question returns to each of us: who will bear the cost of liberation? Who among us will step forward to accompany those who have been set free? Who will sit with the families of those whose livelihoods were damaged? How will our churches behave when the work of God disrupts the neat rhythm of our economic stability? These are not rhetorical diversions. They are the living out of the very question we asked at the start. Why did Jesus allow demons to enter the pigs? We are not yet finished with the argument. There is still more to say about how this ancient episode should shape the practices of healing ministry, the ethics of community response, and the way we narrate testimonies in churches today. There are also further theological clarifications to make about the place of the abyss in New Testament thought and about the limits of what the story claims concerning mental illness and spiritual oppression. But before we move into those applied territories, it is important to rest for a moment within the drama itself and to let the scene sit with us. Picture again the lake, the wet sand, the silence after the panic. The healed man, not simply an object of astonishment but a living subject, sits clothed and composed. The crowd looks on, divided in their response. Some are drawn to wonder, others to fear. Jesus stands at the boundary of the town and its economy, his authority unmistakable, but his mission costly. The scene invites us to make decisions about what we, as a faith community, will do when encounter with evil or suffering produces unexpected and uncomfortable consequences. In the next movement of this reflection, we will take these threads: judicial restraint implied in the demon's plea, the symbolic meaning of the pigs, and the priority of human restoration, to develop concrete pastoral protocols. We will examine how churches can accompany those who are liberated, what restitution and solidarity might look like in practice, and how to build discernment that neither sensationalizes nor medicalizes every instance of suffering. For now, however, hold the image of the lakeshore and the glaring moral question it leaves behind. What are you willing to lose so another may live? If we are to translate that shore scene into the life of a congregation, then the work that follows Jesus' dramatic act is not optional. It is the hard, daily labor of pastoral care. The gospel gives us a single visible miracle, but behind that miracle lies a set of obligations that any community claiming to follow Jesus must learn to carry. These obligations fall into three spheres: immediate care for the person liberated, ethical responsibility toward those who suffered collateral loss, and the long-term formation of the church so that it can discern wisely and act compassionately when spiritual and social realities collide. Begin with the person. In Mark and Luke, the man is clothed, calm, sitting at Jesus' feet, signs of restoration that do not end the work of healing, but begin it. Practical pastoral care must mirror that sequence. First stabilize, then integrate. Stabilization means attending to physical safety, mental health, and basic needs. A person who has been living among tombs needs a place to sleep, food that is reliable, medical attention where necessary, and protection from exploiters. Churches that rush straight into spectacle without ensuring such basics replicate the neglect that produced the man's vulnerability in the first place. A first, non-negotiable pastoral step is to ensure that the liberated person has access to competent medical assessment and psychological support. This is not to reduce the event to biology. It is to honor the embodied nature of the human being the gospel restores. Next comes accompaniment. Restoration is not a one-off event. It is a relational process. The gospel sends the healed man back into his social world as a witness, but the church must not send people back into hostile circumstances without support. Accompaniment can look like helping someone reestablish family relationships, providing vocational training or temporary employment, offering counseling, and linking the person to stable community groups that will receive them with dignity rather than suspicion. Churches can create small care teams, composed of a pastor, a counselor, or social worker if available, and trusted lay people, whose task is to walk with liberated people for months, not merely hours. Such teams keep records, check progress, and coordinate resources, always with permission and respect for the person's agency. Alongside accompaniment goes a clear posture of non-exploitation. Testimony is precious, but those who have been healed should never be pressured into public appearances or media moments. The healed man in the Gospels is commissioned to testify. That commission is a vocation he embraces because he is ready. In contemporary practice, leaders must carefully discern whether someone's public sharing is freely chosen or a coerced performance. Consent, preparation, and follow-up care for those who testify are pastoral musts. If the first axis concerns the liberated person, the second concerns those who suffered material loss. The herd that is lost in the narrative represents real livelihoods, and the gospel does not permit us to ignore material harm. Christian discipleship that values persons over possessions does not therefore abandon economic justice. On the contrary, it compels the community to respond to loss with tangible solidarity. Where we can, churches should explore forms of restitution, compensation, or creative economic assistance for those who have been harmed as a consequence of ministry that liberated others. Restitution may take different shapes depending on context. In small communities, it might mean pooling funds to replace a business asset or providing work until the owner recovers financially. In urban congregations, it might mean helping arrange microloans, job placement, or community-sponsored commerce initiatives. Even when a precise accounting is impossible in a historical text, the moral imagination of the gospel points us toward action. If our ministry produces collateral damage, whether intended or not, we must stand with the injured, not turn our faces away. That solidarity prevents the gospel from becoming a license for harm in the name of spiritual advantage. Practically, to operationalize restitution, churches should adopt simple, transparent protocols. Designate a small ethics group or diaconal board to receive reports of collateral harm, investigate claims with care and fairness, and recommend forms of reparation or support. Keep aid separate from testimonial or publicity agendas to avoid conflating charity with conversion metrics. In contexts where litigation or legal ramifications are possible, advise legal counsel rather than unilateral decisions. The point is not to produce paper bureaucracy for its own sake, but to protect the vulnerable on both sides, the liberated person and those harmed economically, so that the community's response is both merciful and just. The third and perhaps most consequential domain is formation. If the episode of the Gerasene demoniac teaches anything about how the church should prepare for spiritual work, it is that discernment must be cultivated and multidisciplinary. No single leader should be positioned as the final arbiter in complex cases, where spiritual, psychological, and social factors overlap. Instead, form teams that blend theological wisdom with professional expertise, pastors trained in biblical exegesis and pastoral ethics, counselors with competencies in trauma-informed care, medical professionals who understand the basics of psychiatric diagnosis, and lay leaders who know the local social economy. This is a posture of humility, an acknowledgement that the gospel does not promise us a manual that converts every human story into neat categories. Training is the backbone of such formation. Leaders need basic literacy in how to recognize signs that warrant medical referral, sudden shifts in cognition, persistent hallucinations that impair functioning, patterns consistent with known psychiatric disorders, while also learning to identify dynamics that may suggest spiritual oppression as a possibility. But this identification should never proceed by checklist alone. It must be accompanied by prayerful discernment, careful history-taking, confidentiality, and ongoing collaboration with health professionals. Encourage leaders to cultivate relationships with local clinics and counselors so that referrals are not an afterthought but a natural part of the care pathway. Part of formation is cultivating a theology that resists sensationalism. The Gerasene story is dramatic, but drama should not be the measure of ministry. Teach congregations the difference between honoring the reality of spiritual evil and indulging in spectacle. Sensationalizing suffering feeds voyeurism and damages dignity. Sober, humble ministry builds trust. Model this in worship, in testimony spaces, and in educational settings. Celebrate God's power to restore without making the church a theater for the miraculous. Equally important is cultivating a theology of risk and cost. The Gospels repeatedly show that Jesus' work disrupts systems. If the church wants to participate in that disruptive mercy, it must be willing to bear costs. Practically speaking, congregations can plan for risk by establishing emergency funds, training volunteers in trauma-informed response, and building networks of mutual aid with other churches and social agencies. When we expect disruption, we are less likely to respond with fear and more likely to respond with compassion. A posture of pastoral prudence must also shape how the church handles testimony. The healed man's public witness in the Gospels bypasses sensationalism and becomes an instrument of mission. Contemporary churches should steward testimonies ethically, prepare those who will speak, guard their dignity, and ensure that the telling of a story does not re-traumatize the teller. Create pathways for testimony that are restorative. Small groups, confidential sharing sessions, or carefully moderated public storytelling that foregrounds the glory of God rather than the gory details of human suffering. In matters of discernment, return to the text's humility. Mark 5 and Luke 8 show us a confrontation. Jesus faces legion with sovereign authority, but neither gospel provides a manual for diagnosing every disorder as demonic, nor for performing exorcism as a routine, unilateral exercise. We must resist the temptation to turn a narrative into a normative checklist. Instead, let the story refine our questions. What is the person's history? What precipitated the distress? Are there signs of physical illness, substance-related issues, or known psychiatric disorders? Has the person been exposed to trauma? Are there spiritual indicators, such as a pattern of coercive spiritual experiences, ritualistic symptoms, or direct expressions of other spiritual beings, that warrant specific spiritual ministry? Each case requires careful listening and layered assessment. When spiritual ministry is pursued, it must be carried out with consent, clarity, and accountability. Avoid exorcistic practices that are coercive or that isolate individuals. Ensure the person understands what will happen. Permit them to withdraw consent, and involve a team rather than one unsupervised leader. Maintain records of interventions, monitor outcomes responsibly, and be ready to adjust the approach in light of medical advice. Remember the biblical caution. Compassion should never become the pretext for abuse. Theological humility also limits our claims about cosmic logistics. When the demons beg not to be sent into the abyss, the text hints at a larger eschatological framework. Scripture elsewhere refers to spirits in restraint, but it does not provide a catalog of metaphysical modes. Avoid constructing elaborate theories about the mechanics of demonic detention. The Gospel's concern is pastoral and redemptive, not forensic. Hold to the mystery. Affirm Jesus' sovereignty without pretending to map every nook and cranny of spiritual geography. A responsible pastoral approach also addresses community fears. The townspeople's demand that Jesus leave is not an absence of moral culpability. It is an understandable human response to sudden economic shock. The church, therefore, must anticipate public reaction and prepare to mediate tensions. When a ministry produces visible social disruption, appoint responders who can explain the pastoral rationale, offer restitution options, and facilitate face-to-face conversations between parties. Encourage narrative repair. Let the newly liberated person tell their story in trusted settings where those harmed can ask questions, voice grief, and receive apologies or explanations. Narrative, when carefully managed, helps communities move from suspicion to solidarity. Missional imagination follows naturally from such care. The healed man's mandate to go home and tell models a picture of restoration that is outward-facing. Freedom is not a private commodity. It is a witness to God's kingdom. Churches should therefore invest in enabling testimony that invites reconciliation and transformation. Provide training for storytellers. Create forums where testimonies become bridges rather than battlegrounds. And expect testimony to catalyze service. People who have encountered grace often become laborers for others in need. But mission requires practical supports. If testimony leads to a surge of people seeking help, whether spiritual or medical, be ready. Build referral networks, create clear intake processes, and coordinate with local health services so that the church's compassion does not overload its capacity. Consider partnering with community nonprofits, social services, and counseling centers to expand the network of care. Such partnerships dignify both the spiritual and social dimensions of ministry, modeling the integrated approach the gospel calls us to adopt. There is also a public witness in how the church addresses restitution. When communities see believers stepping forward to help those who have lost livelihoods because of ministry, they will more readily attribute integrity to the gospel. If by contrast the church celebrates a miracle while leaving ordinary people to fend for themselves, the witness is hollow. Act in ways that bind the work of mercy to the ethic of repair. If funds are provided, be transparent about them. If jobs are offered, make them sustainable. If training is given, ensure it leads to real opportunity. The quality of our response to collateral harm will shape both evangelistic credibility and the integrity of our discipleship. One particularly delicate area that must be handled with pastoral sensitivity is the intersection with mental health. The gospel honors the spiritual dimension of life, but it does not deny the reality of suffering that arises from neurological, psychological, or chemical causes. Avoid simplistic either-or formulations. Instead, practice an integrated approach. When symptoms suggest a medical condition, refer immediately to appropriate professionals. When spiritual oppression seems to be present, minister prayerfully and collaboratively with consent and alongside clinicians. Encourage leaders to learn basic mental health literacy and to foster local relationships with psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. This collaborative posture protects the vulnerable from misdiagnosis and ensures ethical, comprehensive care. At the same time, refuse the temptation to reduce every spiritual problem to a clinical label. The church is the place where people are recognized as spiritual beings embedded in social and cosmic contexts. We must recover theological language to speak about attacks, spiritual bondage, and deliverance, while also refusing to weaponize that language against someone with a psychiatric disorder. Keep theological claims proportional to biblical evidence and practice pastoral caution. Training for such integration should include protocols for dual-track responses. When someone presents with distress, conduct a safety assessment, risk of harm to self or others, seek immediate medical attention if indicated, and then convene a discernment team. That team should include at minimum a pastoral caregiver and a mental health professional. If spiritual ministry is deemed appropriate and the person consents, proceed in a team-based way, keeping clear documentation and follow-up care. This model reduces the abuses that can arise from lone actor interventions and respects both professional and spiritual competencies. There is an educational task for congregations as well. Teach the congregation to tell responsible stories about deliverance. Avoid glorifying collateral damage. Resist triumphalist narratives that suggest that every prayer will produce dramatic spectacle. Instead, root testimonies in Scripture, Mark 5 and Luke 8, and in theological humility. Teach the community why Jesus' actions prioritized human dignity, and why the church's response must mirror that priority in both compassion and justice. In moments when church leaders must make difficult decisions, anchor those choices in the narrative's enduring priorities. Jesus' sovereignty, the dignity of the human person, and the community's ethical obligations. Those priorities help answer practical questions. Should we intervene publicly or privately? When is medical referral compulsory? How do we compensate those who suffer loss? They also shape the posture of leaders: humility, accountability, and a willingness to bear cost. The relational economy of the church matters. The healed man's mission is effective because he re-enters a social world that can receive him. Our ministries grow when relationships are strong. Therefore, invest in small groups, mentorships, and neighborhood-based care. When liberation happens in a network of relationships, the community is more likely to welcome the healed person and less likely to default to fear. Conversely, isolated ministries produce shock and scandal. Reflection on this text must lead to practical commitments. Here are 3 concrete actions any church or any believer can take this week to embody the lessons of the Gerasene episode. First, identify a vulnerable person or context in your community where freedom is at stake and sit with them. Do not rush to solutions, but listen and record the real social costs they face. Second, convene a conversation in your faith community about protocols for discernment and dignity. Invite a mental health professional to help you draft a simple, written pathway for assessment, referral, and restitution. Third, if you have a story of restoration in your own life, consider how you might share it in a way that promotes healing rather than spectacle. Prepare the teller, ensure consent, and offer follow-up care. These are small practices, but they reconfigure how a church lives, from spectacle to stewardship, from triumphalism to costly compassion. They echo the gospel priority manifest on that lakeshore: persons above property, restoration above convenience, and a willingness to stand with both the liberated and those injured by liberation's cost. Finally, the moral question returns like the tide. What are you willing to lose so another may live? The historical scene forces us into a choice. Will we retreat to safety when freedom appears costly, or will we risk scandal in order to follow Jesus? There are no easy answers, but there is a pattern. Jesus places dignity first, invites risk, and commissions restored people to tell what has been done. The cost of discipleship sometimes includes economic loss, social discomfort, and a willingness to stand with neighbors whose livelihoods have been disrupted by grace's work. That is not a call to recklessness. It is a summons to prepared charity. If this reflection has stirred something in you, if you feel both unsettled and called, take a next step. Identify one vulnerable situation in your circle. Sit with that person this week and listen. Bring leaders around the table and begin drafting a simple protocol for discernment and care that includes mental health referral and a plan for communal restitution. And if you have experienced restoration in your life, pray about the safest, most honoring way to share that story, so it might become a bridge for others. Mark and Luke do not leave us with a tidy ledger. Instead, they leave us with a man restored, a herd lost, and a town confronted by a costly mercy. The gospel's question remains: whose side will we be on when freedom makes history messy? May our churches be communities that answer with courage, caring for the healed, making right the harmed, and forming leaders who combine theological wisdom with pastoral prudence. If this message spoke to you, I invite you to share a testimony or a reflection in the comments. Keep it honest, keep it gentle, and to subscribe so we can continue to pursue careful readings like this one together.